Today we're honored to welcome Arlina Allen, an inspiring author and self-esteem expert who has dedicated her career to helping individuals transform their lives from the inside out. Her wonderful new book, The 12-Step Guide for Skeptics, Clearing Up Common Misconceptions of a Path to Sobriety, offers a fresh, compassionate perspective on recovery and personal growth. Through her powerful work, Arlina challenges us to look beyond external solutions and dig deep into our core beliefs. She understands that true healing begins with recognizing our inherent worth and changing the subconscious narratives that have held us back. Her message is simple yet profound. We attract and allow into our lives exactly what we believe we deserve. And I've listened to so many talks with Arlina. She's got a great podcast, One Day at a Time podcast. You'll find her on YouTube, wherever you find podcasts. She's been doing it for 8 years and has hundreds of interviews. And they're really cool. They're really interviews with people on the recovery path. And her new book clears up all the misconceptions, all the misinformation. If you've been around the 12 steps for long enough, you know there's a ton of it out there, especially now with social media, misconceptions about confusion about the meetings and the program and all that stuff. Thank you, Arlina. Over to you. Great to see you. Go Niners.
Good honors. Patrick, that was such a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. Like no pressure to live up to all that. But I am super excited to be here. It's always such a pleasure and honor to be able to get to talk to my people who get my kind of crazy and make me feel at home. And listen, my favorite thing to do is talk about myself. So here we are. Captive audience. I just spoke at it was online, but for a men's prison, the Arizona men's prison system. There was like 200 people online, and I was so worried. It took everything in me not to make the joke that I had a captive audience. I did not say it, but I was so nervous. I was like, are these people going to relate to me at all? And then I remembered that even though our circumstances are different, the feelings are all the same, right? Like, I understand that people who struggle with addictions, compulsive behaviors, however you want to, whatever lens you're kind of looking at this through, is that we all know what it's like to suffer, to not be able to process uncomfortable feelings, to want to avoid those uncomfortable feelings, and to struggle with these survival skills that we developed early in childhood that, although they helped us to survive, they don't really translate to healthy adult living, healthy relationships, even with ourselves. I was so excited to hear that you guys do have IFS meetings because I'm slightly obsessed with IFS and some of the tools that they offer to do things like resolve internal resistance. So that's my brain latches on to something. I am an absolute self-help junkie. So I got sober ever since I got sober. Actually, 2 years before I got sober, I was introduced to some like Tony Robbins stuff, and it was introduced to this idea that if you change your mind, you can change your life. And I think when I needed to get help and stumbled upon the 12 steps, it had already opened my mind to maybe this process. So, but I feel like I should probably, start from the beginning. And it always makes me nervous when someone starts their story with "I was born," because I was like, "Oh my gosh, how much are we gonna hear?" And I promise, I swear I'll skip over most of the boring stuff. But I think it's so important to sort of talk about like childhood stuff because that really sets the stage for the rest of your life. And that was definitely my case. My parents were very nice people, middle class American. My mother was from Mexico City and my daddy was from Kentucky. And I grew up in Silicon Valley in California. And listen, there was a couple things that happened that really shaped my identity. And a lot of what I talk about, self-esteem, all this stuff is around identity stuff. And the two biggest thing that happened when I was really young, I was actually abused by a neighbor. It was like an ongoing thing, starting at the age of 5, and then my parents divorced when I was 7. And I was growing up in the church and was introduced to these ideas about, you know, God and love and these ideals that I was to try to live up to, and what I understand now is that these ideals are like mental constructs. It's like the horizon, right? The horizon is a mental construct. You can walk towards the horizon, but you will never arrive, right? It's something. So these ideals I was learning were just sort of presented, they were presented as things to work toward. But in my mind, in my little, at that age, you have very concrete thinking, and I'm so literal even to this day. But I was like, oh, I need to be perfect. And then even at such a young age, I was already living this double life of the little girl that I thought I was supposed to be and things that were happening to me that were outside of my control, right? So I started developing these ideas that something was wrong with me. And, that is, you know, in sobriety, I have learned about something called the default mode network. It's the way your brain develops. It refers to your neural circuitry. There's this great book called What Happened to You, which is such a great question because it's just a slight turn of phrase from what's wrong with you. And I grew up thinking, what is wrong with me? Like my whole life, I was like, what is wrong with me? I couldn't act right. I couldn't live up to these ideals. And and I think when my parents divorced, there was something in me that thought it was my fault. If I had just been good enough, maybe daddy wouldn't have left. Right. And listen, my dad was always present in my life. He was like I saw him all the time. He was a great dad. My parents were not mean to each other, so it was peaceful. Man, it just destroyed me. I had such a hard time with it and turned all of that sadness into self-loathing. So that by the time I was about 10 years old, it was between 8 and 10. I actually don't know how old I was. My mom had remarried when I was 10. And this night I'm going to describe happened when she was out on a date. So I honestly don't know how old I was, but between 8 and 10. And this evening was when my mom went out for dinner and I was home alone with my older sister. And I thought it would be a great idea to drink some of the booze that was in this dusty old bottle. I never saw my parents drink. I don't even know where I got this idea. But there was this dusty old bottle, probably somebody had left at our house after an evening, whatever, I don't know. But I remember the excitement I felt about knowing that I was going to do something naughty. I remember taking that first drink, how the alcohol burned my lips and my mouth, and it burned all the way down. But that when it hit bottom, like this warmth spread through my whole body. And all of a sudden, like all that self-loathing, self-consciousness, all those bad feelings, they were like lifted, and all that was left were like these really good feelings. And I actually didn't realize how bad I felt until I felt really good, right? It was the juxtaposition of those two feelings, the self-loathing and then the freedom. And it was really relief, is what I was feeling. That experience like burned in my psyche forever. I was like, this is the thing. I can do something to change how I feel. And obviously, I didn't become like a daily drinker at that age, but I was a binge drinker. That night, I drank so much that I threw up everywhere, and my sister cleaned me up and put me to bed, and she never told my mom a thing. Years later, I asked her, how come you never said anything to mom? And she said, because I would have gotten in trouble. Like she would have been responsible for my behavior. And that was sort of a recurring theme that happened in our house. Like you weren't responsible for your own behavior, but you were responsible for others. And when I was a teenager, my sister she had mental illness. She was depressed. And I think my mom was really scared. And my mom was a really strong person. She never showed any emotion other than anger, usually. My mom had like two main feelings. She was either really happy or really pissed off. And I felt like she saved her happy face for the outside world. And I don't say that to disparage her. As a woman, I grew up and I have two kids of my own. And I can look back and go, wow, she was tired. she's working full time, raising these two girls. And although my dad, he was a good dad, he didn't live with us, right? So she was doing it all on her own. And she probably was tired and she didn't have any coping skills, right? Like, so she had no emotion management. So if she would come home and the house was dirty and she was like obsessively clean. I was not. My nickname when I was growing up was Pigpen. So it gives you a little clue. So she'd come home, the house would be a mess, and she'd freak out, and I was always in trouble. It was like, and I've had two predominant feelings when I was growing up. It was either guilty or wrong, right? So there's a lot of chaos in my house. Um, and so between that first drink and my last drink, I had my last drink on my 25th birthday in 1993. Between my first drink and my last drink, I would have what I would refer to as a lot of episodes, right? A lot of episodes. It was crazy. Like I'd wake up the next morning and just be like, what was that all about? Like the night before. Like I had no way to process my feelings other than to just shove them all down. When I was growing up, and my mom didn't do feelings really. If you're gonna have some feelings, you're gonna have them over there. And so I just learned to isolate and shove my feelings down. And when I drank, all that would explode like a volcano. And I never knew, like I had these alter egos that would come out when I was drinking. It was either Badass Betsy or Wimpy Wendy, because I was either fighting or crying, sometimes both. And then later I realized, oh, there's a third alter ego, Slutty Susan. She always shows up. And everybody loves her. Like literally. That was part of my dysfunction, shall we say, seeking male validation and looking to the outside to fix my inside. So that's kind of how I was. I was a hot mess. And so I would have these episodes, but I was in total denial. Like I thought that that was kind of normal for my age, right? But things started happening. Like things started getting worse and worse. And the reason I had well, let me just back up a tiny bit before I tell you about my bottom. Or I did have a 2 year period where I was moderating my drinking, and it came on the heels of a really bad night with my sister. I had burned through all my friendships. Nobody wanted to hang out with me anymore. And I drug my sister out. And I write about this in the book because this was like a very pivotal moment. I took her out. I got super hammered. I was supposed to meet this guy there. He didn't show up. I was really sad, but I was still behaving badly and lost my damn mind. And so my sister somehow got me out of the bar and she was driving my car. And as we were going home, we drove past my married ex-boyfriend, who was a DUI cop, and he pulled somebody over and was giving a field sobriety test. And my sister says that when I saw that I lost my damn mind and that I punched the windshield in a couple places and broke it, really bruised my hand. She said I was trying to crash the car. She said I kicked her in the face and gave her a bloody nose, and she somehow managed to pull the car over and ran to a neighbor's house. My childhood friend was on that street, and they came out, and I think the police were called. And I just have a little, how like when you wake up the next day and you're like, you have little bits of memories from the night before. I had like this little bits of memory of one of the gals being like, it's not worth it. And I don't know what she was talking about, but I calmed down. I didn't go to jail. My sister got me home somehow. And that's the last thing I remember. I woke up the next morning with like this sickening, sinking feeling that something terrible had happened the night before. And the guy that wasn't at the bar was there, and my hand was all bruised, and I didn't know why. And I had to go to my sister's house to find out what happened. And she was so pissed at me. And I was so humiliated because now my mom knew everything that happened. And she did not raise me to behave this way, right? I was so out of alignment with my own values. And I sat there and I listened to her, and it was like the incomprehensible demoralization. Like, how did I get here again? Again. Like I swore I would never be that way, but it kept happening. I had no control over what happened to me once I started drinking. And she told me that she was going to start going to Al-Anon. And you know what I did? I clutched my pearls. I was like, what, for me? Because of me? Like, that's how in denial I was about my drinking. But that started the questioning. Am I an alcoholic? Do I have a problem? What makes me different from other people? And it seemed like one question led to another. And over a 2 year period, I tried to moderate my drink and I just failed over and over and over again. I tried all the things, glass of water between drinks, switching from hard alcohol to beer and wine, to eating before I went out, to not taking as much money with me when I went, just like all kinds of nonsense, right? None of it worked. I could never control like how much I was going to drink once I started. And there were two guys that I worked with who were in the program who were kind of over time, sort of doling out little bits of wisdom. They would say, you know what, Arlena, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to keep getting what you're getting. And I was like, I thought that was so profound. I was like, you know what, you're right. And they were just, it's not the first drink that gets you, what's that saying? Anyway, you know what I mean, right? It's like not the first drink that gets you drunk. It's whatever. I'm totally ruining that one. But you know what I mean? They were just like breaking off of these little bits of wisdom. And I was just soaking it in because I had been trying to be different. I really had. I spent like that 2 years in the self-help section at Barnes and Noble. I thought it was relationships that was going to fix me. I thought more money was going to fix me. I thought it was either love or money that was going to fix me. And as it turns out, it wasn't that far off. It was love that saved me, but it didn't show up in the way that I thought it would, right? Like I thought it was going to be the knight in shining armor coming to rescue me kind of a thing. I thought it was going to be a dude. Alas, no, because nobody wanted anything to do with my hot mess, which is probably a good thing. They say that what you're attracted to when you're sick will repel you when you're well. I think that's why they say no relationships your first year. Anyways, so anyway, Mitch and Randy, these two fine, upstanding members of Alcoholics Anonymous, kind of Eskimoed me in out of the cold, as they say. And Mitch took me to my first meeting, and Randy was sort of explaining the first few steps to me, you know. And I was so grateful for their guide. They made me feel safe. I didn't have a lot of trust in women. My mom had, regularly like disowned me, so I didn't have like great relationships with women. I saw women as competition, because I was such a fiend for like male attention, right? So I didn't have great relationships with women, but Mitch was like, the women work with the women and the men work with the men. And I was terrified of the women. I had spent so much energy like decorating the outside that I really didn't feel like I had anything going on the inside. But I did meet this woman. I started going to meetings, and listen, 30 years ago, there really wasn't anything else other than 12 step. And Mitch one time had the steps on like a little bookmark and he slid it across his desk and he's like, what do you think of this? And I read it and I was like, oh no, it had God on it. And I was like, if that's what this is, I'm not going to be able to do it because I had rejected God because God never fixed me. I'd been begging God to fix me my whole damn life and still human, right? And I couldn't act right. And so I was like, you know what? If I can't be good, I'm going to be good at being bad. And I was going to earn my seat in hell. That's what I was going to do. And when Mitch showed me this list of the steps and it had God on it. And I was like, oh, if that's what this is, I'm not going to be able to do it. And this very sweet woman, she pulled me aside and she goes, you know what? You don't even have to worry about that part. You can like redefine it. And I was like, what are you talking about? She said, let's make a list, two lists, a list of everything. Like, let's just pretend that there is this thing and just write down all the positive attributes that you would want it to be. And then make a list of all the things you don't want it to be. So I made my lists. I was like, it needed to make sense to me. So to me, it was like energy, it was like love, it was like that kind of thing. And anyway, I made my list and she goes, okay, are you done? So I hand it to her and she tore it down the middle and she handed me the positive side. And she's like, okay, we're just going to start with this. I was like, that's it. She's like, that's it. She's like, you get to make up. It has to make sense to you. And you get to redefine this word. She told me if I had a problem with God, I probably had a problem with somebody else's God. And that was true for me. Like all these things that people were telling me about what God was did not make sense to me. And she's like, some people around here, they use water. Water is their higher power, or they just use energy. Like when you plug a lamp into the socket, there's energy. Two of us together is more energy than me by myself. Like that's kind of how I had to think about it, right? And and I was like, okay, I'm just going to start because my way is clearly not working. So I'm willing to try your way. Your life seems to be working for you, so let's do that. And then I kept hearing like you had to get a sponsor and work these steps, and people were doing steps one, two, and three and relapsing. And I was terrified of relapsing. And so they told me I needed a female sponsor. So this woman I met remembered my name the second time she met me. Arlina is not a super easy name to remember, but she remembered my name the second time she met me. And it was as if the clouds had parted and the sunshine was on her rays of, and it was like, oh, like the angels were singing, like this was the one. It felt like a sign. And so I was like, hey, will you, the way I asked her to sponsor me, I was like, will you listen to my inventory? And she was like, you know what? I would be honored, but we're going to start with step one. And that's what we did. And bless her heart, I write about her in the book too, Kimmers. She was the kindest, nicest person. She just was so empathetic and compassionate. I was so ashamed about so many things I had done. And she would explain things to me like, when you're under the influence, you are literally not in your right mind. I eventually did get to my inventory with her and I sat with her and I went through the whole thing. And it was so interesting to write out the inventory because that's when I could see my patterns emerge. That's where I could see that my self-esteem was taking hit after hit after hit in all these interactions I was having with people, and that there was so much fear in my life. And I was making decisions about myself and about my life based on fear. And it was so interesting because it was, I've had other sponsors where I call them up and when I started dating, I would say, oh, Bobby did this and Bobby did that. My sponsor would say, well, you know what? I don't sponsor him. So we're gonna focus on your part. And I was like, bitch, that is so rude. But she would help me. My sponsors always helped me get to the place where I had empathy for the person that I had the resentment towards. And I would be able to see how sometimes they were actually responding to things I had done or said. And I was like, oops, that awkward moment where you realize you're the asshole. That was kind of my experience in some of the four step. But I was always met with kindness and compassion. And I was told that if I could just, the funny thing about resentments and anger for me, there's this saying that the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off because it will be challenging some of your long held beliefs. And for me, it was about, I had come to understand that if I could lean into this anger and see it as a sign that underneath is actually sadness. Second, anger is actually a secondary emotion. And that underneath is sadness. Anger is a lot easier to feel, right? Self-righteous anger. Well, who doesn't love that? I mean, social media has shown us that sex doesn't sell anymore. It's self-righteous anger, right? That's what people are into. And that was definitely, I was hanging on to my self-righteous anger. And I was taught that there was sadness under that. And if I had the courage to sort of set aside my anger, to really get in touch with what happened to me, like what was going on with me on the inside, that it was a sign that something needed to be healed. And this process of the steps was a way to sort of mechanically deconstruct all that stuff. And, I'll tell you, so I love the steps. They were a magical process for me. I continued to work them, but I never did just the steps, right? Like I became a seeker. I became a self-help junkie. I started reading so many books. I've read hundreds of books around psychology, relationships. It was like I wanted to sort of unravel like all the stuff that was going on in my mind. 12 step helped me manage the crisis of addiction, and it helped me to learn how to interact with others by taking responsibility for my own feelings, like a whole emotion management. I learned that I was practicing image management, which was putting up this facade of who I thought I was supposed to be, not really my authentic self, right? So I started to learn about who I really was, who my real authentic self was, over time. It took a long time. And then it was like years into sobriety when I started realizing that what happened to me wasn't normal when I was little. Like I had kind of normalized what had happened, and I didn't realize that that was actually trauma. So I started doing trauma therapy. I did EMDR, CBT, tapping. I've IFS, like all kinds of therapies. Because, 12 step is peer support, right? Like we do help each other out, and the peer support is amazing because, it gives us an opportunity to be of service. And as somebody who is really focused on rebuilding self-esteem after addiction, I've come to understand that service is probably the fastest way to start rebuilding self-esteem because it's hard. Like when you help somebody else out, or you're available, even if it's just to listen, it's hard to look into the eyes of gratitude and feel bad about yourself, right? There is this connection that happens when we're in service. And so it was a beautiful place to start. But these people aren't professionals, and so I started going to the professionals for the more serious things. And I'll tell you that over the 30 years that I've been sober, I've seen people, who repeat patterns. Like I got stuck in patterns. I see other people get stuck in patterns. And it's really hard. There's this saying that it's hard to read the label from inside the jar. When I'm in my feelings, when I'm in my patterns, meaning I have an experience, I have a feeling, which creates a thought, and I make a decision about this kind of thought, and then I take action and then invoke the law of cause and effect, and then have an experience. This is like this confirmation bias loop. This in behavioral psychology, they call it the cybernetic loop. I get stuck in these loops, and because I'm emotional about the situation, it's hard for me to see clearly. That's like, have you ever had a friend come to you and they're like with their troubles about their person that they're dating, and you can see the situation clearly. You know exactly what the answer is because you're not emotional about it. Like emotion will color our perspective, and that's why I feel like it's so important to have people around you who that are kind of compassionate, but will also be honest with you and maybe insert a little bit of information because that cybernetic loop is based off of limiting beliefs. And it's hard to see when you're in it because a limiting belief is either missing information or incorrect information. And so it's nice to be able to run things by other people who can be objective, and even the professionals can give you insights and wisdom to help reframe some of that information so that as feelings arise, we come to different conclusions, we make different decisions, invoking the law of cause and effect, we have different experiences, right? And for me, that's how like my patterns have been changing, right? And I've been really focused on things like building self-esteem because if I think about it, I'm living in the residual of all of yesterday's decisions, right? Like from the chair that I'm sitting in to the house I live in to the jobs I decide I'm qualified or not, the people who treat me well or not. Like I'm choosing who I invite into my life. I choose who has my attention and who doesn't, right? And this all comes back to personal responsibility. And my decisions are largely based on my level of self-esteem. And so, I really do a lot of work on, self-reflection and working on raising the level of my self-esteem. And it's the kind of work that it's like I liken it to like exercise. If I go to the gym every day for a year, I'll be in good shape. But if I stop going, I'll go back to my default, right? Like the default mode network, like how your brain's operating system is. And so I understand that if I stop doing the work of recovery, of self-esteem, I go back to my default, right? And it wasn't super healthy. So I'm grateful that I have this thing, alcoholism, addiction, whatever you want to call it, because it does give me quite an incentive to stay on the path. I stay on the path because the consequences are pretty severe for someone like me. But I'm grateful for that, right? It's good to have boundaries. And so, I could probably talk about this all day. What I will say is that, the 12 steps are a worthy endeavor, and there are so many other tools available to us today. Like, we are living in a time of a tremendous amount of information, right? There's a lot of things that are available to us that weren't available to us before. And all it takes is a little bit of courage, right? A little more yes than no. There's this law of 51%, if you think of like a balance scale, right? And all you need is a little more yes than no. You're actually, and it just speaks to this idea that you actually might be closer to your goal than you think, because all you need is a little bit more yes. We don't have to make it to the end of the marathon to win. For this, we just need a little more yes than no so that we take the actions that will benefit our lives. So, anyway, thank you so much for letting me share. So I actually didn't really want to write it. Like, I thought I was gonna write like the Great American Memoir. Last no, I'm not not that kind of writer. But what was happening for me was it's like I was interviewing all these people on the podcast, and I'm open to all paths of recovery. I'm definitely not like this way is the only way. I'm not that girl. But people would come on and I'd do a little pre-screen and I'd ask if they were 12-step oriented because I want to be sensitive to some people are very sensitive about what they share. There's a lot of confusion around secrecy and anonymity. And so anyway, I just try to be sensitive to that. But I couldn't help myself. People would say, "Oh, no, I didn't do 12 step." And I'd have to ask why. And I would never like outwardly like invalidate somebody's experience. But when I would hear these reasons why, in my mind, I'm like, that's not a thing. Like, that doesn't have to be a reason. It's like, oh, I'm not that bad. I don't like those people. Um, Somebody said something to me at a meeting, and I was like, I'm never doing that again. They were just like all these things that they were saying. I was like, there is a way around that. It doesn't have to be a barrier. And in the beginning of the book, I talk about this story from Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth, where he's talking about the beggar and the stranger. And there is this guy that walking down the street, and a beggar holds out his hat and he's like, "Hey, can you spare some change?" And the stranger's like, "I don't have anything to give you, but what's in that box?" And he's like, "Nothing, it's just a box." And the stranger's like, "Have you ever looked inside?" And then when the beggar stands up and looks inside, he finds that there's treasure. And so Eckhart Tolle is talking about, I'm the stranger, I have nothing to give you, but everything's inside. But what I see is like another lesson. It's like the beggar had a preconceived idea of what the box was. And so he didn't open it. And I feel like people who don't understand what 12 step is, it's like they have a preconceived idea about it. And so they never explore it. They see words like God, powerlessness, alcoholic. Those are like the three big trigger words, and they disregard it. They throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And so I was like, you know what? Let me just see if I can help with that in like in a compassionate way, because I understand some people go to meetings and they have a bad experience. And if you're in a really vulnerable place and you go to a meeting and somebody is unkind or you know how we are. Sometimes we're a little prickly. And if someone gets their feelings hurt, I feel really bad about it. And I'm like, hey, there's some more context and perspective to what's happening. For instance, the steps and the meetings are two separate things. The program is the steps. And we go to meetings to like meet like-minded people and things like that. But steps and meetings are like soap and water. They kind of work better together. But there's a lot of confusion at meetings. People don't necessarily I think we have a lot of opinions, don't we? But they're not always rooted in the literature. And so, anyway, I was just trying to say things like, there's no one person that represents the entire organization. If you don't believe in God, that's cool. Whatever you believe in is fine. Like, you don't have to believe in anything, to be honest. And so there's a way around every obstacle so that you can get all the benefits without all the bullshit. You know what I mean? Like it's a worthy endeavor. It's magical. You work the steps, they work you. It's like mental deconstruction in a way that's you will change if you just give it a chance. So that's kind of why I did it. I didn't want to, but I was like, just couldn't take it anymore. That's why I did it. So hopefully that's a good enough synopsis of it.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's very useful.